Hey folks, it's Miss Sinclair for AP World History Modern. Today we are finishing up our Unit 3 lectures by looking at the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. So, identify and explain one similarity and one difference between the Protestant and Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. Our notes today are on the scientific revolution. So this finishes us up for Unit 3 in topic 3.3, empires and their belief systems. That's the objective from the AP, but that's not the objective we are going to be looking. Instead, our objective for today will be looking at continuities and changes within the intellectual life in Europe. So, what is the scientific revolution? Well, the scientific revolution is going to really look at the secular side of things, right? It is an intellectual movement in Europe that by the 17th century, so that's the 1600s, had laid the groundwork for modern science. So it will be initially associated with planetary motion and other aspects of physics. And within the 17th and 18th centuries, aka the 1600s and 1700s, we see that new ideas in science began to really emerge. They will create laws of nature based off Greek and Islamic science coming out of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, coming out of Samarkand with the Timurid Empire, and coming out of Cordoba and Toledo from the Cordoban Al-Andalus Caliphates. So it starts with astronomy, and it starts with Copernicus. So, let's see, do I have a slide for Copernicus? I do. All right. So Copernicus is a Polish scientist. His big claim to fame is that he disproves Ptolemy's geocentric theory. He is able to scientifically prove a heliocentric universe. So what's a heliocentric universe versus a geocentric universe? The question is, what's at the center of the universe? Is it the Earth, like Ptolemy thought, and everything revolves around the Earth? Because, ancient people can clearly see the sun moves across the sky, the stars move across the sky, things are moving out of our atmosphere. Well, Ptolemy, who is a Greek astronomer, he will create our first world map. He is going to, in many ways, create the science of astronomy as we know it and its foundations. Well, Ptolemy thinks Earth is at the center. Copernicus works off the ideas that he had been studying from his own observations and the planetary movements and the records of that he received from Muslim scientists in the Middle East. And he will be able to prove that, actually, no, the sun's at the center of the universe. But you have to remember, who's in charge of everything? The Pope, right? The Catholic Church. And that means, according to Catholic tradition and theology, God created the heavens and the earth is special and it's at the center of the universe. So to say that the sun is at the center of the universe would go against the Catholic Church. So Copernicus decides he's not going to release his theory until after his death because he doesn't want to get in trouble with the Pope. You also have Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, like the Kepler telescope. So these two scientists are both going to be Danish. They are going to build off of Copernicus's model. They will strengthen and improve it. And they'll be able to observe and prove that planets move in an elliptical motion. So it's not a perfect circle. It's like an egg. All right, finally, you have Galileo Galilei. So Galileo's Italian. He is also going to be able to confirm Copernicus's theory of a heliocentric universe using a telescope. He will observe the motion of the planets, and he will put forth his ideas and be condemned by the Catholic Church. He will be put under house arrest for many years. He'll be put on trial by Pope Urban VIII, and he will eventually recant his views to stay out of prison. So why are people criticizing the heliocentric model of the universe? Why is it a big deal to begin with? Well, it challenged popular ideas and it challenged the intellectual synthesis of classical and biblical authorities, right? They figured out a way to merge these ideas in the Renaissance, building off the classical Greek, specifically, and Roman traditions with biblical theology, and putting the sun at the center of the universe throws a wrench into that. We have other scientists emerging during this time. A big part of why the scientific revolution will be able to happen is because of the printing press, right? So it's not just, hey, I have an idea, let me write it down. It's, hey, I have an idea, let me publish it and send it to every other university and scientist in Europe. And so they can look at my ideas and prove them or disprove them or disagree. So even though the number of scientists you have participating in this is a tiny number. It's a tiny number of men, like less than a dozen in every country is a number I just made up, but it's very, very small, right? Most people don't know how to read, let alone think about how many people in this country study astronomy, and everyone knows how to read here, right? So consider like how many people would study astronomy out of the literate population in Europe and who weren't also a priest. Very small number of people. However, the intellectual dialogue going between these men will really increase with the printing press. They will also be able to disseminate their ideas outside of this small scientific circle with the printing press as well. So other scientists include William Harvey in England. He proves that we have a circulatory system in our body and it's powered by the heart. This seems like, yeah, no duh, but no one had done autopsies. Like it was illegal to exhume dead bodies and cut them open. So you didn't know. You have René Descartes, who's a big, important philosopher in France. He's the father of modern philosophy. He's going to be very skeptical of accepted learning. And he is the man who puts forth the idea, I think, therefore I am. Where is my Enlightenment? So I'll come back to my Enlightenment thinkers. Let's focus on the scientists. So the scientific method that you are all familiar with, I'm sure you've heard your science teachers across your years of schooling mention it. The scientific method is pretty straightforward. You have a hypothesis. I think if I drop my pen, it's going to fall to the ground. It won't just float. You then come up with an experiment to prove your hypothesis. I'm going to drop my pen a bunch of times in a row and see if it falls to the ground every time. You come up with alternatives. Will my phone fall to the ground if I also drop it? And then you put forth your ideas and your data and whether or not your hypothesis has been proved, and other people will repeat your experiment and prove or disprove it. Right? So this method, codified, allows for empirical research. It allows for scientific institutions to be established, for norms to be established. So Francis Bacon, who's English, and Isaac Newton, also English, will really build on this idea. So Newton is going to invent calculus. He will define the forces of gravity. So you guys will take physics next year. And so you'll learn so many of Newton's equations about gravity and force and velocity and all that jazz. And he puts forth the basic principles of motion, like that of inertia. An object in motion stays in motion. An object at rest stays at rest. Francis Bacon is really going to put forth the idea of empirical research, that you will observe phenomena and you will record data about it and then study the data and your observations. He will argue that scientific truth must be deduced. You can't make assumptions. You have to look at the whole and then draw a conclusion. You can't start with your conclusion and then just cherry pick evidence to prove it. So there is the institution of scientific institutes and universities to advance research. We see the growing belief that people could control and even calculate, understand the natural world. You see the growth in things like insurance companies, right? Especially as you start sending ships across the Atlantic Ocean. Gosh, wouldn't it be nice to know that if your ship goes down, you won't lose all of your money? Well, insurance companies want to know, what are the risks, right? They start wanting this data. You also see the emergence of a more modern medicine. So these doctors will really criticize and attack healers and, quacks. Now, to be said, I've read a lot of medical history because I find it fascinating. A 17th and 18th century doctor is not that far away from a quack, but they are going to be starting research and building their ideas off of scientific research instead of just being like, eat this toad and it will make your warts go away. Finally, the last idea I want to introduce for the scientific revolution part of things, and then this will really help us transition into the Enlightenment itself, is the idea of Deism. Deism is a sort of religion based on reason. So, if you are a deist, you are not a Christian, you're not a Muslim. It's really just the idea that there is a higher power. So, there was a God, there was a creator who created the earth and the universe, who set all the laws in motion, but this God is no longer actively involved. All he did, he's like a clockmaker, right? That's the analogy used. All he did is make the universe. It's like you would make a clock. You'd put all the gears in motion, all the springs, all that jazz, and then you seal it up and hands off. If you've made your clock well, it's going to continue to run and keep time on its own. You're not going to need to open it up and mess with things. Deists believe God did the same thing. God created the universe. He set forth all of these laws of nature. Then he sort of closed up the system and is hands off. He might be still out there observing, but God is not actively intervening in your life. So it doesn't make sense to pray, right? Being like, God, save me from this disease. God's not going to save you from the disease because he's not actively intervening in the world. So the most famous American deist would be Thomas Jefferson, right? There's a lot of sort of general belief that the American founding fathers were all super Christian. They weren't. Most of them were only nominally Christian. Thomas Jefferson, for example, famously has the Jefferson Bible, where he cut out bits and pieces of the Bible to sort of fit his own worldview. And so he would be a deist. And many of our founding fathers really are Enlightenment men. They build their ideas off of the Enlightenment. You'll learn all about that next year in APUSH and then in AP Government as well as a senior. Deism is a way to try and reconcile religion with science. And we see that the West, for the first time in thousands of years, really becomes the leading center of scientific research, right? So if we're thinking about the center of scientific research, you have first sort of the ancient world, think Egypt and Greece and Rome. Then it will move to the Dar al-Islam, right? The Islamic world, first in Baghdad with the Abbasids, then in Cordoba with the Al-Andalus Caliphate after the fall of Baghdad, and then it will return to Europe after the Reconquista. So, yeah, please watch this video. There's a whole crash course on history of science, and it's very fascinating. But for our purposes, I just want you to watch the one on the scientific revolution. All right. The Enlightenment is going to be a huge idea that we will really build off of in Unit 5 when we start talking about our revolutions. But I want to introduce it now. So, the Enlightenment is a philosophical movement in the 18th century, so 1700s, in Europe that fostered the belief that one could reform society by discovering rational laws that governed social behavior. Okay, let me draw that out for you a little bit. You see a direct line from the Protestant Reformation to the scientific revolution, to the Enlightenment, to all of our revolutions, right? So with the Protestant Reformation, one of the big things that you see Martin Luther doing is A, questioning authority, B, saying we got to do research and go back to our sources, right? He's saying, Pope, you don't know what you're talking about, read the Bible. All right. This sort of gives you permission, and when you add to that increased literacy and the printing press, it means you have a growth in science as well, as they question the accepted norms that the Catholic Church had been putting forth, geocentric universe, and are able to pass along and perpetuate their ideas, looking at the sources, looking at the data. So with the scientific revolution, you discover all of these natural laws that govern the universe, gravity, physics, all that jazz. Then they start to think, well, what about society? Surely if there's natural laws that govern the natural world, surely there are similar laws that govern society. If we understood those, then we could improve society. So, part of the reaction of the Enlightenment is in response to all of the wars of religion. Remember, after the Protestant Reformation, you have like almost a century of violence in Europe between Protestants and Catholics. Now, part of it is over theology, but a lot of it is over power, right? Who's in charge? Who do you answer to? The Pope or yourself, right? If you're a Protestant king, you can do what you want. So you see changing attitudes about politics, society, and economics. And during the Enlightenment, we will see a continuation of scientific advances. So what are the basic beliefs of the Enlightenment? Well, the basic beliefs are humans are inherently good, but can be educated to be better, right? This is already in contradiction to Christian theology of any branch, right, of Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox. A foundational belief of Christianity is that humans are inherently sinful, right? And because we're inherently sinful, humans cannot save themselves. There's nothing humans can do that will be good enough to earn salvation. So that means they need a savior. Jesus comes to earth, dies for human sin, and those who believe in him are saved. So if humans are inherently good and can work to become better, you don't need Jesus. You don't need Christianity. Let's be clear, though. It's not like every Enlightenment thinker is an atheist, or even that agnostic and atheist ideas are dominant. Once again, our intellectual leaders that we're talking about here make up a very, very tiny part of the overall population. And although their ideas will be influential in the long run, they are not reflective of what most people are thinking in their time period. All right. So the Enlightenment thinks people are inherently good, but can be taught, can be educated to be better. Reason is the key to truth, If you want to understand truth, you have to be able to think it through it rationally. Religions that rely blindly on faith and do not tolerate a diversity of ideas are inherently wrong. So it really begins with the philosophes, French philosophers meeting in salons, which are really don't think like a nail salon. A salon is a place where writers, artists, nobility, the bourgeoisie, thinkers, where essentially interesting people with ideas to share would meet in France and just talk about interesting things. So, who are some of the people we see associated with the Enlightenment? One is René Descartes, like I said, French guy, father of philosophy. His big thing that you will hear quoted a million times, I'm sure you already have, is I think, therefore I am. So I'm sure you've heard the joke. René Descartes walks into a bar and the bartender says, "Can I get you a beer?" And Descartes says, "I think not," and disappears, right? That's not what he means. He means the only aspect of reality that we can really know and be sure of is our own perception of it, right? So we go through our lives thinking, okay, what we're going through is real. But how do we know that you're not in a coma somewhere in a hospital and this is all just a dream, right? How do we know that we are not all characters in some, video game? Or that that this isn't the Matrix situation? How do we know that you are a real person with your own consciousness and ideas and not an AI or part of some other person's dream or turtle's, imagination, right? How can you trust that reality is real? Well, you can't really, right? There's no way to objectively prove that reality is real, especially when you consider the ways that you experience reality is going to be very different from the way I experience reality, right? I can say, look, this is the color blue. And we might both agree that, yep, this color right here is the color blue. But what you see when you look at that color and what I see when I look at that color might not be the exact same thing. We've both just been taught that when we see this color, it's called blue. But what you see might be what I consider to be red. All right, I'm not trying to make your brains hurt. I'm trying to say, René Descartes says, look, we can't be sure of reality. What can we be sure of? I can be sure that I'm thinking right now. I can be sure that I am perceiving the world around me and I am thinking about it. So therefore, the only reality I can really be confident of is my own perception of it. Big stuff. He is a foundational philosopher. All right, you also have men like Denis Diderot, who is going to create the first encyclopedia. Seems not that exciting, but he will be sent to prison by the Catholic Church because he makes an encyclopedia. It's our first real compilation of knowledge. And then, of course, you have Voltaire. Voltaire is a big deal. When a classic Enlightenment thinker, he's going to write novels. He's going to be very witty and popular, and make fun of the king, write about religion and all of these ideas. So like Catherine the Great of Russia will correspond with Voltaire. And because he's so charming, he can get away with saying some criticisms about the absolute monarch that other people can't. All right, go back. What about political and economic Enlightenment theories? Well, the big one that will come out of this is going to be the social contract. The social contract is a contract between citizens and the government. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau is really going to be the guy to put forward the idea of the social contract. So these ideas are going to become a really big deal when we start talking about our revolutions in Unit 5. And so I will go into more detail for them there. But basically, Rousseau argues that governments must act on behalf of the people and through the consent of the people. And if a government is not acting on behalf of the people, is not governing with their consent, then they can rebel, right? So when you have these absolute monarchies doing whatever they want that the people don't like, well, then the people have the right to overthrow their government. You also have the ideas proposed by John Locke. So John Locke is going to build off of these ideas as well. John Locke is going to be really influenced by the English Civil War and the Glorious Restoration. So John Locke is going to be William of Orange, who will become King of England's tutor. He builds off of Rousseau's initial idea of the social contract, and he introduces the idea of natural rights. That humans have natural rights, and those rights are life, liberty, and property, not the pursuit of happiness. So he's going to link private property to individual liberty, and he recognizes that in government, to have a functioning government, it requires that humans give up some of their rights. You might think no, it's the job of government to protect rights. Sure, but you have to give up some of your rights to be part of civilization, and we're okay with that, right? So technically, I have total freedom. I have the ability to drive 100 miles down the road and drive really recklessly. Okay, but why is that a bad idea? Well, I could get in a car accident and I could hurt someone. So I give the government the right to stop me and punish me for going over the speed limit. So why am I giving up that right, my right to drive how I want, when I want? Well, because it will also protect me. It means the government will also have the right to regulate how other people drive. So other people driving recklessly won't endanger my life. So as people living in society, we choose to give up some of our rights for the good of society, right? I choose to pay my taxes because I think having a fire department and public libraries is a good thing. You give up some of your rights, but you do it for a greater good to be in society. Now, when government is not upholding their end of the bargain, well, then that's a different matter. For economic theories, you have Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. He's a Scottish guy writing out of Glasgow. And he is going to argue that people will always act in self-interest, but economy will thrive through competition. So the idea of sort of the invisible hand of the market, which sort of directs which way investment should go, will be good for your overall economy. His ideas are going to be really influential as we start seeing a much more globalized economy with colonies emerging. He also argues that governments should only participate in the economy when it's for a public good and a market failure. So that means government should do things that will benefit everyone and the market has not addressed effectively. So, for example, roads, right? Governments should build up roads because it's good for society, it's good for the economy. And when you allow private companies to do roads, you get toll roads, you don't have roads into isolated places. So roads would be a great example of public goods and market failures. Finally, some of our Enlightenment philosophers disagree with I disagree with, but they would articulate that absolutism is a good and effective government system. So you have Thomas Hobbes, another British dude, and he's writing in the chaos of the English Civil War, where John Locke is writing later after the Glorious Restoration, right? Different context, different conclusions drawing. Thomas Hobbes says that man originated in a state of nature. So our natural state, humans, when not in society, we are inherently violent, selfish, and we will hurt others to get what we want, right? It's not a far-flung idea, and it's certainly the plot of like many a post-apocalyptic movie. So you need a strong government to keep society under control, because humans cannot be expected to self-control. We're going to abuse each other. We're going to steal from each other. We're going to be cruel to each other. I think we can see evidence of that in history and in the world today. So Hobbes argues, though, that you need a really strong, powerful king, because people will only obey laws when they are afraid of the consequences. And to seek individual security, people will enter into a social contract with the ruler, surrendering their rights for protection, right? So Locke will build off of Hobbes's ideas. However, Hobbes is saying, yeah, people don't really want this. It's because we're inherently violent and we need an authoritarian ruler, essentially, to hold us all in check, where John Locke has a much more optimistic view of the human nature. Finally, Jacques Rousseau is going to articulate that the king has divine rights. So a king's authority stems from God alone, and thus the king's authority is absolute. No other institution can or should challenge or put a check on his power. And he, in return, is charged with the responsibility of looking after his people. However, Rousseau would also argue that the king would still be subject to laws and tradition. So very clear who is writing in France underneath an absolutist king. All right, so this is a very, very brief introduction to Enlightenment thought. We are going to build off of these ideas even more. How did the Reformation influence the scientific revolution, and how did the Reformation and the scientific revolution influence the Enlightenment? Please watch this one. If you get a chance, I would really like you to watch this one if you can. All right, let's do some practice questions. The scientific revolution demonstrated that the workings of the universe could be explained by applying which of the following? The critical cause of the scientific revolution was the most significant challenge posed by early modern astronomers was that of the heliocentric universe, first argued by many religious and intellectual leaders viewed the new science with suspicion, as shown by the Catholic Church's renunciation of Okay, for your summary, I'd like you to explain continuities and changes within the intellectual life of Europe during the period 1450 to 1750. If you have any questions, please ask. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.